Hi everybody, welcome to my presentation on if the world is flat. Let's get into it. Before we get into my presentation, I would like to give sort of like an overview of what's going on with my presentation and what to expect within it. There's three main points that I want to get into. The first one is an example of a developed versus a developing nation, which is what we're going to be going over in the next first few slides. There's going to be one example of each. And then we're going to have an argument for both sides regarding whether or not the world is flat in terms of like income disparity, wealth disparity, human development index, and so on and so forth. And then the last thing we're going to get into is what has been done to try and resolve any kind of existing gaps, if there is any. So let's get into it. Okay. Another thing before we get into the actual presentation itself is what I'm basing how businesses are able to start in those countries is the Human Development Index, which takes into account things like healthcare, education, and longevity of the humans in that country, which is why it's called HDI. And one of the major reasons why I chose the best developed versus the worst developed was based on their HDI, because a Human Development Index is a good indicator of whether or not a business will be able to function properly in that nation. So my developed example is Sweden. They're pretty well known for having a well-developed economy that caters to its citizens, and this can be proved pretty well by the fact that they have their 8th highest HDI, which is something that I based being able to start a business off of. But they're a special case because they have a sort of economic safety net in that their government pays for education and healthcare so that the people living there don't have to worry about those expenses as much, and therefore they'll be more likely to take a risk to start a business than the average nation, I suppose. And then we compare this to a developing example, something like the Central African Republic, which is a nation that has the second lowest HDI in the world for many reasons. One of them being that they're embroiled in the midst of a civil war, and they also have poor infrastructure. Infrastructure is very important when you're trying to develop a business. And through this, we can come to the conclusion that these two factors, amongst the other things, that this is a very not good place for you to start a business, at least currently. But in the last, I would say, decade or two, the amount of inequality in terms of income has been consistently going up. And this coincides with the average HDI across the world going up as well. Not only this, but also developing nations are being a focus of major nations across the world because of the interconnectivity of our world. We're getting a first-hand look of what people in developing nations are going through. So people are beginning to get more concerned about those areas and putting more money and resources into those areas so the world can kind of flatten, as we are talking about now. But I don't believe it is flat yet. I think there's still many things that we need to do. And we'll get into what has already been done in a little bit, but there's something I need to talk about first, which is income inequality and wealth inequality. Income inequality is something that has been improving overall in the world these past few decades, meaning that the lower, the bottom part of people who make income is getting closer to top people who make income, but wealth inequality hasn't been improving at all. It's actually been getting worse. And the difference between income inequality and wealth inequality is that income inequality is the amount of readily available funds to spend that a person has, whereas wealth is everything that a person has, including money, but also assets and things like that, things that are not necessarily meant for spending. And what this means for developing nations is that there's going to be a bigger gap in the amount of people who are on the upper echelons and the lower echelons in terms of wealth. The poorer people in those communities will have more money, but so will the rich people, and it will be by a much wider margin. So the world is getting more rigid overall, believe it or not, but there has been some actions taken to try and remedy this. One of them that I'd like to point out is that in 2019 alone, across the world, there was 1.52.8 billion in developmental aid in 2019, which is a lot of money, and it's been steadily increasing over time. And the U.S. accounts for 23% of this spending. That's just something that I'd like to point out. The 0.2 GNI, gross national income, is how much income people have earned in that specific country. So 0.2 of our gross national income is being spent on developmental aid, and that's 23% across the world. So we are definitely taking steps to try and remedy this flatness issue, but there's definitely more that we could do in this time. And I'm going to get into that in this slide. What should be done? These are just a few of the things that I saw on the websites that tried to advocate for more equality in terms of both income and wealth. These are kind of the common themes that I saw in those areas. One of them is maintain stability, and that is in terms of both government and corporations. Government in the sense that you don't want governments feuding amongst each other or having civil wars in the case of the Central African Republic, so that they can focus on passing laws that benefit the businesses that are just getting into the market. And then the second one is kind of obvious because it's what I'm basing my entire presentation off of. It's increase HDI, which makes it more likely for a person to be able to start up a business in that area. And then spur industrial growth. This means through subsidies, grants, and so on and so forth to new entrepreneurs. And then increase spending power, which is putting more money, not necessarily more money, but more wealth in the hands of the average man, so that they'll be able to buy more products from startup businesses. In my opinion, though, I think that people who are lending aid to these developing nations need to spend their money in a more intelligent way, because I feel like a lot of the foreign aid that we give to other countries is just in terms of numbers, and we aren't really focusing on what we're using to improve those nations, I guess. I think that we should implement some standards so that we, as in the second point says, decrease dependency and increase efficiency. So we're just not throwing money at these countries and they don't do anything with it but spend money and not try to use it to increase efficiency in that country, to try and spur development in that country, I guess. And I agree with one of those points and what should be done, and that's what my third point is trying to point out, is work with world leaders. That kind of goes hand in hand with the maintain stability thing that I was talking about earlier, where people in the government should work together to pass laws that are beneficial to businesses, especially new businesses, so that the economy can grow. And in conclusion, just to sort of summarize, the world is in the process of becoming flat. It's not perfect yet, but we're getting there. It's starting to sort of flatten down over time. The incomes are leveling, but wealth is polarizing. So it's getting more rigid in that sense, but because of the recent actions that nations across the world are taking, that's kind of getting diminishing returns in terms of how far the top person is getting from the bottom person. And also, the infrastructure and internal problems of a nation must be solved before we can do anything about trying to promote business growth in a certain nation. And that's the end of my presentation. And here's a quick look at my sources before I end my presentation. So, there we go.